Our reading from the Bible is in Matthew chapter 5, not Mark. Matthew chapter 5, part of the Sermon on the Mount. And in this section, what Jesus seems to be doing is taking some of the commands and saying, you have heard it said, you've heard the command. And then he takes it deeper. And indeed, that's what he does here. You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that every one of you who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one of your members than for the whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one of your members than for the whole body to go into hell. Friends, this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. I do, she says. I do, he says. This is more than just a simple conversation with a few words, isn't it? A couple is making a promise. A big promise. You see, they envision a future, a lifetime, a way of life together. They will bear witness to each other that their lives and their loves matter. Promise keeping. And if the promise is broken because one of them is reckless with the promise, the hurt is deep and it's shattering and it's crushing. And families and communities are less. For some reason, and I haven't quite figured it out yet, but for some reason, country music is really good about gathering up the words and the thoughts and the feelings when a marriage promise is broken. If you know country music, probably some of those songs are coming to mind now. One is "The Thunder Rolls" by Garth Brooks, and he sings of this peace giving way to a storm. 3:30 in the morning, not a soul in sight. The city's looking like a ghost town on this moonless summer night. Raindrops on the windshield. There's a storm moving in. He's heading back from somewhere that he never should have been. And the thunder rolls. The thunder rolls. Carrie Underwood sings of the anger and the desire for retaliation when the promise is broken in her song, "Before He Cheats." She sings this: I dug my key into the side of his pretty little souped-up four-wheel drive. I carved my initials into his leather seats. I took a Louisville Slugger to both headlights. I slashed a hole in all four tires. Maybe next time he'll think before he cheats. And Toby Keith sings of the heartache and all the confused feelings when you discover that the promise has been broken in his song, "Wish I Didn't Know." He sings this: I never ask you where you're going. I never ask you where you've been. I never called and checked your story when you stayed out with all your friends. I've never tried to catch you lying. I didn't want to know the truth. I'd rather go on loving blind girl than go on loving without you. You shall not commit adultery. It's the seventh commandment. God's desire is for deep and faithful marriage relationships, and these songs capture some of the pain and the brokenness for people and communities when the behavior goes off rails and the promise is broken. You shall not commit adultery. Broken marriage promises are the topic, of course, of conversations and magazine covers and books and movies and, of course, songs. Sometimes it's close to home, and sometimes it comes home. Sometimes we are surprised, and sometimes not so much. But with a little thoughtfulness, it's always sad. I don't think we would want to argue for a return to the rigid self-righteousness of Nathaniel Hawthorne's A Scarlet Letter. But at the same time, I think we know it should be more than just a shrug of the shoulders and saying, well, that's just the way it is, and accept it. You shall not commit adultery. In the patriarchal society of ancient Israel, there was a double standard with adultery. A married man only committed adultery with another married woman. A married man having sex with a single woman was not adultery. However, a married woman committed adultery with any other man. You see the double standard. You see, the primary issue back then was not sex, but it was about offspring. Life back then depended on family and lineage and tribe. It was a matter of knowing who was entitled to the property, the honor, and the status within a community. Adultery and pregnancy could destroy a family and a community because it got all that confused. That's why it's punishable by death in ancient Israel. And while the death penalty was rarely carried out in the ancient society, it did remind the ancient community of the importance of the command and the destructive power of putting personal desires above responsibilities and promises to the family and the community. In our "it's all about me" culture, we are reminded that adultery is about more than me. Marriage in ancient Israel was not first about romantic love. You probably know that. Rather, it was based on economic partnerships and combining resources and extended family and development. It's not to say that strong feelings of love did not grow in ancient marriages. Often they did. But it is to say that marriage was about more than a man's and a woman's personal feelings and needs. Marriage and faithfulness to marriage were the foundational building blocks of that ancient society, and they still are. But ancient Israel also knew of the power of love and the longings in the human heart. In the creation poetry of Genesis 2 that Lisa read, we find this man with this deep feeling of loneliness. And it's not the intention in God's good creation, then or now, that anyone should have that feeling of loneliness. So God brings birds and animals to the man, and they're nice, but they don't fill the void. They don't fit the need. They don't fill the place in the man's heart. So God causes this deep sleep to fall upon the man, and in that mystery makes a partner from the man's rib from his own substance. This woman is like the man, but also different. It's sort of like two complementary puzzle pieces that fit together. That's the idea in the Hebrew word, a partner, equal and loved. And the loneliness is resolved. In trust and dependency and hope, they cling to each other. That is the poetry to the promise of marriage. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not commit adultery because it destroys families and marriages and communities and that promise of trust. You see, adultery is never just about a person and now, it's also about others and the future. The commandment reminds us that marriage and families must be protected from the selfish choices of the human heart. As human beings, we all have feelings, but there must be boundaries for those feelings, or much harm is done. And those boundaries extend farther than we might think. In Jesus' teaching in Matthew 5 that I read, we see that his interpretation of adultery goes beyond what happens with the body. Jesus pushes the intent of the command into the boundaries of our hearts and our minds. In Jesus' teaching, adultery includes lust, fantasies about having needs met by someone other than a spouse. The command knows that what happens in our heart and mind can betray the promise of marriage, cheapens the person who is the object of the desire, and can lead to actions that break the promise of marriage. And we know now that lustful fantasies also change the structures of our brain, which then changes our decision making. The synagogue in Jesus' day did not include women. And at the temple in Jerusalem, women could not enter the court of the men. You see, there were these physical barriers that kept men and women separate. It was sort of this outside physical way of addressing lust and not tempting men and women with adultery in their practice of faith. So they were just separated physically. But in the early church, those old barriers came down. As Paul writes in Galatians, there's neither Jew nor Gentile, male nor female, slave nor free, but all are one in Christ Jesus. Being one in Christ Jesus meant that everyone was gathered together in one church. These old barriers of separation were gone. But there was a problem. Lust and promise breaking at marriage was still a concern for those early Christians. So what they did is the barriers that were once outside were removed, and they put then the barriers inside, into the heart, into the mind. The expectation was that men and women would be transformed, growing in the character of Jesus Christ. Guards against adultery and lust called for this transformation of the heart. And you see, that's the point of Jesus' command. Adultery includes lust, so you need to have a transformed heart. The early church called men and women to more, a faithfulness in action and in thought. We live in a highly sexualized culture. Hard and softcore pornography in images and videos and websites and stories and in dress encourage a crossing of faithful boundaries and a breaking of promises. Addictions to pornography, sexual harassment, and sexual abuse are the consequence. Often the line between what we're willing to do and what we're willing to imagine can get very thin. We do our best when we keep our actions and our thoughts faithful to the promise of marriage. You shall not commit adultery. So what happens when we do? When we fail? When we fall? In act or in thought? The much-loved story from John chapter 8 that Lisa read for us addresses this issue. A woman is brought before Jesus, and as you saw, it's the old double standard. She's been caught in adultery, but the man, where's he? He's been let go. The religious leaders then, with the woman there, remind Jesus of the law. Though rarely followed, she could be stoned. What does Jesus say? You see, they want to put Jesus in a hard place. Famously, Jesus tells the religious leaders that whoever is without sin can throw the first stone. And with that, Jesus turns the tables and puts them in the hard place. There's then this powerful silence as quietly the religious leaders leave one by one. They know they've all sinned. And they know that Jesus has called them out on their abuse of power and privilege over this woman. But there's more to the story. Jesus does not condemn the woman, but neither does Jesus excuse her behavior as if it didn't matter. Rather, Jesus offers her the power of grace. There is grace to forgive, and then there is grace to live a new way, a better way. Neither do I condemn you, he says. Now go your way, and from now on, do not sin again. Grace to forgive and grace to live a new way. You see, Jesus doesn't need stones or the threats of hell. The woman already knows what that is like. Rather, Jesus offers her the power of grace. And that's more than enough. It's more than enough then, it's more than enough today. You shall not commit adultery. It's about husbands and wives. It's about actions and fantasies. It's about families and communities. It's about guidelines and grace. And it's about promise keeping. A small boy, 8 years old, finally 8 years old, finally old enough to be on a baseball team. It seems like he's waited a lifetime to be 8, and he's got this ball cap, and if it weren't for his ears, it would smother him, and he's got this big old glove. With cap and glove, he stands in front of the mirror. It's Friday and his mom is fixing dinner. What time did the coach say we were to start practice? I think he said Tuesday afternoon. I better call the coach and see what time we're going to start practice. Tuesday, Jimmy, Tuesday at 5 o'clock, the coach tells him, I'll be there, coach. What time did you say? Can you tell me again? Tuesday, Jimmy, Tuesday at 5, the coach repeats. I'll be there, coach. Finally, after an eternity, Tuesday finally gets there. It's 3 in the afternoon. Dark clouds fill the sky. Some distant thunder starts to roll. A light drizzle turns into rain. It starts to come down hard. At 4:30, his mom says, Jimmy, this is terrible. I am so sorry. I know you are really looking forward to it. It's supposed to start today, and while it's raining so hard, you're not going to be able to have Jimmy. But Jimmy, he's out the door. He's gone. He's on his bicycle, and he's got the off. He rides through the rain, splashing through the puddles. The practice is on the old grade school field. The coach lives across the street. His wife calls him to the window and tells him that there's a boy standing in a lake that used to be home plate. The coach says, what's he doing over there in water up to his knees? The coach gets his umbrella and a raincoat and boots, and he sloshes over to the field, and he tells the boy, what in the world are you doing here? It's raining. We can't play ball today. The boy looks at the coach and says, I told you I'd be here, coach. I gave you my word. I promised. Now, we might think the boy is foolish. And I suppose in time the boy will discover that people often say one thing and do another. And I suppose that he'll discover he can do that too. We all discover that. But it seems to me right now, at 8 years old, he's on to something. Something important, something about integrity and truth. And saying and doing the same thing, something about promise keeping and trusting that it's right. There's power in promise keeping. I do, he says. I do, she says. There's power in promise keeping.